This is my third and final installment in my critique of theonomy. Now I want to ask the question, is theonomy confessional? And by confessional, I mean, does it comport with the Westminster standards, the Westminster Confession of Faith and catechisms? This is a highly debated question, and the answer to this is that it's complicated. It's not a simple answer, yes or no. There is a sense in which theonomy is confessional, and there is a sense in which it's not. First of all, the sense in which it is confessional. We have to recognize that it was widely believed in the 16th and 17th centuries by Reformed theologians. It was widely believed that the civil magistrate is set up to be a custodian of both tables of the law. So recall in the traditional understanding of the Decalogue that the first four commandments pertaining to our duty to God refers to the first table, and the second half, the commandments 5 through 10, deal with our duty toward man, and that's the second table. So according to the magisterial reformers, the civil magistrate is not only responsible to enforce the second table of the law regarding our duty toward our fellow man, but also the first table of the law regarding our duty toward God and the enforcement of the true religion. For example, Calvin in his Institutes says very simply that the duty of magistrates extends to both tables of the law, that the civil magistrate has a responsibility to see to it that piety is maintained and supported in society, that the church is encouraged, and that the laws of the nation are in conformity with and supportive of Christianity. This is widely held by the reformers. You can see this in the writings of Theodore Beza, John Knox, the great Scottish Presbyterian reformer, George Gillespie, and so on. They all follow this tradition. Even the original Westminster Confession of Faith, in its 1646 version, holds to this view. So in that sense, Bahnsen is correct that theonomy is confessional to that extent. Theonomy, if you're viewing it in this broader sense of being this idea that church and state are both, they're distinct institutions, but they are both under the authority of God's law, and that the state, the civil magistrate, is responsible to enforce the law in society, not just in the second table area, but also in the first table in regards to upholding the true religion. On the other hand, the Westminster Confession does not teach Bahnsen's presumption of continuity argument. So in that sense, theonomy is not confessional. So if we're looking specifically at the issue of Bahnsen's presumption of continuity argument that the entire Mosaic law, minus the restorative laws, is the moral law, and that it's binding today unless rescinded or modified by later revelation. If we're looking just at that, we would have to say that that is not taught in the confession, and it's not confessional. Furthermore, further complicating things is that the American Presbyterian Church revised the Westminster Confession in 1788, right at the outset of the founding of the new United States of America after the Revolutionary War. They revised the confession to take out this idea that the magistrate is a custodian of the first table of the law. So let's look at these 2 points here. So we're going to take them separately. First, we're going to look at, does the Westminster Confession teach Bahnsen's presumption of continuity? And then we'll look at the American revision in 1788. So first, let's look at the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 19. Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 19, is on the law of God, and The confession holds to the traditional threefold division of the law that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. It's explicit in Aquinas. There might even be some antecedents before Aquinas. But the threefold division of the law is that the Mosaic law is like a pie that can be divided into three sections: the moral, the ceremonial, and the judicial laws. So the Westminster Confession starts off by talking about the moral law in chapter 19, paragraphs 1 and 2. In paragraphs 1 and 2, it talks about the moral law. It says that the moral law was given to Adam before the fall, and then after the fall, it continued to be a perfect rule of righteousness and was delivered by God upon Mount Sinai in 10 commandments. So chapter 19, paragraphs 1 and 2 is the moral law. Then paragraph 3 turns to the ceremonial laws. Besides this law, commonly called moral, God was pleased to give to the people of Israel, as a church under age, ceremonial laws. That is, all the laws that deal with the sacrificial system and that prefigure Christ and his work. The confession states that the ceremonial laws are abrogated under the New Testament. Then in paragraph 4, we come to the judicial laws. To them also as a body politic, he gave sundry judicial laws, which expired together with the state of that people, not obliging any other now, further than the general equity thereof may require. So a plain reading of Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 19, contains 2 points that contradict theonomy. The first point is that the judicial laws, according to the Westminster Confession, are distinct from the moral law, not a subset of it. So Bahnsen has a twofold division. He divides the Mosaic law into 2 parts, the moral law and the restorative laws, although I mentioned before that he equivocates a little bit because he makes it sound at times as if the entire Mosaic law is unchanging moral law. But then at the same time, he, in other places, will say it's not, because there are certain parts that have been modified in the New Testament, and those parts are the restorative laws related to sacrifice. But the point is, he does not hold to the threefold division of the law. He holds to a twofold division of the law, moral and restorative. That means that restorative is basically the same as ceremonial, so that means that the judicial laws in his system fall under the moral law. But the Westminster Confession says no. The Westminster Confession says there's 3 parts to the Mosaic law. Only the moral law is the one that is still binding. The ceremonial laws have been abrogated, and the judicial laws have expired. The second point that is clearly distinct, that sets up a difference between theonomy and the Westminster Confession, is that whereas theonomy says that the judicial laws are moral and therefore are morally binding today, the Westminster Confession says that the judicial laws have expired together with the state of that people, that is, the people of Israel, and do not oblige any other nation now. That's directly the opposite of what theonomy is saying. Theonomy is saying that the judicial laws have not expired and that they do oblige all the other nations now. The Westminster Confession says they do not. Now, we do have to recognize that the Westminster Confession does add this last phrase here. It says that the judicial laws are not obliging any other now, further than the general equity thereof may require. So we have to examine what that phrase means. What is general equity, and how does that relate to the judicial laws? So Bahnsen interprets this clause, further than the general equity thereof may require, as essentially taking back the expired and supporting the presumption of continuity. So then why did the confession even bother to say that they expired? So I don't think that's a very good interpretation of the confession. There's a very helpful article by Craig Troxell and Peter Wallace called Men in Combat Over the Civil Law. that deals with the question of what is general equity in the confession. It's in the Westminster Theological Journal in 2002, and I would highly recommend that you check that out. But they argue there that general equity was a technical term in the 17th century that referred to the higher sense of justice and fairness that balances and transcends the letter of the law. So they did a word study on this phrase general equity, and they found it was used in a number of uh, writings from this time period, from the 16th and 17th centuries, and they showed that the meaning of general equity was not the meaning that Bahnsen gives to it. So Bahnsen he interprets the phrase general equity as referring to the moral principle that is contained in any given judicial law, any given case law. So the illustration that he would give is the example in Deuteronomy of the law of the parapet. So this is Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 8. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you may not bring the guilt of blood upon your house, if anyone should fall from it. So in Bahnsen's understanding, the general equity of this principle, or the principle of this verse, which is the general equity of it, is that if you own property, it's your responsibility as the owner of the property to ensure that the property is safe, so as not to lead to unnecessary injury or possibly death. So, he would recognize, Bahnsen would recognize that today we don't build houses with flat roofs where people go up and entertain people up there. So we don't need to build parapets for ours, but we do need to make sure that we try to avoid any obviously foreseeable problems with our property that could lead to someone's injury. So maybe that would apply today to slip and fall laws. If the entryway to your house is full of jagged rocks and uneven blocks of cement, and it's just super easy to see that somebody could stub their toe and fall and crack their head open, then you're liable. And so just make sure that your property is safe and take obvious precautions to prevent people from getting harmed. That's Bahnsen's interpretation of general equity, so that he can basically read that back in and say that all the judicial laws have not expired. They're still binding. It's just that we need to update the details to make sure that they're culturally relevant to our society today. But that isn't, according to Craig Troxell and Peter Wallace, that isn't how the phrase was used back then. Back then it was used in a different way to refer to this idea of the higher sense of justice and fairness that balances and transcends the letter of the law. And furthermore, they point out that general equity was understood in that time period as being based on natural revelation, not on special revelation. How do we know what the general equity is? Where do we get that idea of how do we discern the general equity of the Mosaic judicial laws? According to Bahnsen, the way we do it is by exegeting the verse and then finding the transcultural application to today. According to the 16th and 17th century understanding of it, the reformers and the post-Reformation scholars, like the Reformed scholastics, we determine general equity not by exegeting each Mosaic judicial law, but by looking at the light of nature. And so the light of nature, which, remember, revelation has two prongs. There's special revelation and there's natural or general revelation. Special revelation would be God speaking through the prophets, the writings of Scripture, and so on. But natural or general revelation is God's revelation of himself in creation and in conscience. The conscience of man is aware of the basic decency that is required, of right and wrong, that murder is wrong, that we need to be fair and treat each other right. And so this sense of justice and fairness that balances and transcends the letter of the law is going to have to be based upon God's revelation in nature and in conscience. And therefore, what this means ultimately is that there is no revealed blueprint that all of the legislators of the nations of the earth can go to in order to determine how to write the laws governing their nation. And that means that God gives us freedom to determine how those laws should be written and to make sure that they are fair and just and appropriate for our nation. Now, there are limits, of course, because God did reveal in Genesis 9:6 that capital punishment for murder is something that every nation ought to do. So there are some basic things that are revealed in Scripture, but aside from that, there's much more freedom and flexibility. And so the nations of the earth are not required to become exegetes who simply open up their Bibles and work through all of the case laws and judicial laws in Exodus and Deuteronomy and then apply them to their cultural context. This means then that the state is not obligated to enforce the jot and tittle of the Old Testament judicial laws. And that's almost explicitly what the Westminster Confession is saying, that the judicial laws have expired. They're not binding any other nation now, with the exception that the general equity of them is still applicable to today. And so understanding that term general equity then in this proper historical context, we could say that Westminster Confession of Faith 19:4 and the Bahnsen theory of theonomy are at odds with each other. So theonomy in that technical sense of saying that the jot and tittle of the Old Testament judicial laws is still required today and that states are obligated to enforce them, that that concept, which is the essence of theonomy, is overturned by the Westminster Confession of Faith. Calvin, now remember, we acknowledged that Calvin did believe that the civil magistrate has a duty to be a custodian of the first table of the law. So there is a sense in which, theonomists can look to Calvin as providing some support for their general idea of what they want in society. But even Calvin said, quote, "There are some who deny that any commonwealth is rightly framed which neglects the law of Moses and is ruled by the common law of nations. How perilous and seditious these views are, let others see. For me it is enough to demonstrate that they are stupid and false." So here's someone who really does have somewhat of a theocratic understanding of the relationship between church and state, and saying that the state has an obligation to be a custodian of the first table. He sounds a little bit like a theonomist in that general sense, but when it gets down to the details, he rejects theonomy. He doesn't believe that it's wrong for the commonwealths, we would just say nations or states of the earth, are supposed to follow the law of Moses in detail. And he even thinks that saying that they must follow the Mosaic law in detail is perilous and seditious and stupid and false. I don't know if I would go so far as to say it's stupid, but I agree with him that it's false, and it is perilous to do so. Now, again, we have to admit that in the 17th century, general equity, in their mindset, 17th century reformers and post-Reformation scholastics, they would have understood general equity to include first table duties. And so they would have understood it to include the idea that the civil government should support the church, should have laws against blasphemy and heresy, should have laws supporting Sunday and closing stores and so on. Sometimes those are called blue laws. So I'm not arguing that Calvin and the 17th century reformers and the framers of the Westminster Assembly held exactly to the view of civil government that I'm advocating, because they did believe in first table duties for the civil magistrate. But, and so to that extent, they sounded a little bit like theonomists. But at the same time, we have to be historically accurate and recognize that they were not theonomists in the technical sense of believing in the continuity argument, the presumption of continuity. They were not theonomists in believing that the state was obligated to enforce the jot and tittle of the Old Testament judicial laws. They simply were not. But then that brings us to the American revision of the Westminster Confession on the topic of the civil magistrate that took place in 1788. Because now we see that not only were they not theonomists in that technical sense, now we see that the Americans revised the confession to even remove the first table duties from the civil magistrate. I want to just briefly look at how Bahnsen deals with this 1788 American revision. He has an appendix in his book on theonomy and Christian ethics where he deals with it. But there he fundamentally misunderstands what the American Presbyterians were doing when they revised the confession. The revisions were basically in 3 or 4 main sections here. It was chapter 23 of the confession of the civil magistrate, chapter 31 of synods and councils, chapter 20 of Christian liberty and liberty of conscience, and also the Westminster Larger Catechism, question 109. And we'll look at all of these briefly here. When Bahnsen looks at the changes that the American Presbyterians made in 1788, he focuses primarily on just one change, and he overlooks the other significant changes. He focuses on the fact that the American Presbyterians took away from the civil magistrate the power to call synods. So in chapter 23 and in chapter 31 on synods and councils, in both of those chapters, the original 1646 confession said that that the civil magistrate had the authority and the power to call synods. And of course they did, because that's what was happening back then anyway. In 1646, the Westminster Assembly, which was initially called to revise the 39 Articles of Religion of the Church of England, the Westminster Assembly was a synod that was called by Parliament. So the very idea of church and state being related in this way, church and state are still distinct, but at the same time, the civil magistrate has the power to do things with regard to the state. For example, to call a synod and then encourage the synod to ask the synod to resolve a dispute in religion. The American Presbyterians removed that, and of course they did, because the new American polity is being set up in which, the First Amendment says that law shall not pass, that Congress shall not pass any laws respecting an establishment of religion. So the American context is a new political situation in which the state is no longer being asked to have any authority in the area of religion or of the church. So Bahnsen just focuses on that. He just focuses on this one change, that the American Presbyterians took away from the civil magistrate the power to call synods. And he argues that what they were doing is they were removing any of the last vestiges of Erastianism that remained in the original confession. Erastianism is a term that refers to this idea that when you have a society that is largely Christian, and the church and the state are both key institutions governing that society, like this is the way things were back in the 17th century in England. You had the Church of England, and you had the civil government, which at the time was Parliament. Of course, they were having a big civil war with the king, but it was Parliament primarily. Erastianism was the idea that Parliament had authority, ultimate authority over the church, even though the church is distinct from the state. Church and state are not being mixed together, yet the state has ultimate authority over the church. This was mainly seen in the area of calling of synods, but also in the area of church discipline. An Erastian would say that the church does not have final say in church discipline, that, you know, the church leaders could begin the process of church discipline, but the ultimate say would rest with the state. And the reason for that is because they didn't want to have an unseemly situation, for example, where the church is excommunicating the king or something like that. So church and state are distinct, but yet there is a priority where the state is over the church. Now, the amazing thing is that the Westminster Assembly itself rejected Erastianism. There were a couple of Erastians in the assembly, John Selden, the most famous one of all, but they were an extreme minority, maybe only one or two. And they were roundly and soundly defeated by the majority. The Westminster Confession explicitly rejects Erastianism when it says in the chapter on church censures that Christ has appointed a government in the church that is distinct from the civil magistrate. And yet, Bahnsen is arguing that even though the assembly rejected Erastianism, he's arguing that there's still some vestiges of it left, and that's all that the American revisers were doing. All they were doing was simply clarifying the confession and removing any last vestiges, I guess the last vestige being this idea that the magistrate has the power to call a synod. It's flabbergasting to me that Bahnsen thinks that's all the American revisers were doing, is removing that power to call synods, because he overlooked the other massive changes that the American Presbyterians made to the confession. Let me just show you what they were. The first massive one is in chapter 23. Look at the difference here. In 1646, the original confession said that the civil magistrate has the duty to take order that the truth of God be kept pure and entire, and that all blasphemies and heresies be suppressed. This is the duty of the civil magistrate, to take order that the truth of God, so what is that? It's true doctrine, right? Be kept pure and entire, and that all blasphemies and heresies be suppressed. I mean, just think of what Calvin did with Servetus. Back then, so this is like a couple of generations before, back in the late 1500s, back then it was believed that the civil magistrate had the duty to suppress heresy. So a known heretic like Servetus, who was a Unitarian, who absolutely rejected the deity of Christ, he could be suppressed. And he was. He was arrested, tried by the city council, and he was burned at the stake for that. And the American revision said no. In 1788, they changed that. They took out that phrase, and they replaced it with saying that the civil magistrate may not in the least interfere in matters of faith. So in matters of faith and doctrine, and defining blasphemy and heresy, the civil magistrate may not interfere in the least in those matters. That is a major change, and Bahnsen completely ignores it. He doesn't even mention it. Another major change is found in chapter 20 of the Confession. This is a surprising change. It's easy to overlook because they only deleted a handful of words. But this is the chapter on Christian liberty and liberty of conscience. And this is what the original said. 1646 said, "For there," that is, people who are trying to overthrow the order of society and people who are using liberty of conscience to promote false doctrine and so on, "for their publishing of such opinions or maintaining such practices as are contrary to the light of nature or to the known principles of Christianity." That's a key phrase, the known principles of Christianity. So the original confession isn't saying that the civil magistrate should proceed against people who, let's say, question some detail like infant baptism. But if they're doing so against the known principles of Christianity, like the doctrine of the Trinity, they may lawfully be called to account and proceeded against by the censures of the church and by the power of the civil magistrate. Now, that's the part that the American revisers deleted. They deleted that last phrase so that it would only be the censures of the church that would go against people who are maintaining, let's say, Unitarian heresies and things like that. And what's interesting is that if you look at the proof texts that the original confession had appended to that phrase, and by the power of the civil magistrate, they quoted things like Deuteronomy 13. That's the passage where Moses says that if someone, even in your own family, tries to seduce you to worship false gods, you shall stone him to death. So that would be the public promotion of idolatry. So it's not just talking about someone in the privacy of their own home setting up a shrine to a false god, but rather publicly trying to call other people to worship a false god. Then there's Nehemiah 13. This is the one where Nehemiah enforces the Sabbath by prohibiting commerce on the Sabbath. So that would support the idea of blue laws if you're applying it to, in the thinking of the Westminster divines, applying it to their society. They would say Nehemiah was like a magistrate, and so the civil magistrate has the power to enforce blue laws, to require businesses to close on Sunday, and so on. And then there's 2 Kings 23. 2 Kings 23 is the reforms that took place under King Josiah, where he cleansed the temple. He tore down all the pagan shrines and altars and idols. He burned them in the fire, ground them into powder. He killed all the pagan priests. So these are key passages in the Old Testament Mosaic civil law that deal with the civil magistrates, in their theory, the civil magistrates' responsibility to enforce the first table of the law in society. All of these proof texts are simply deleted in the American revision. They delete this last phrase, and by the power of the civil magistrate, and they delete all these proof texts, which go on for pages. And in their place, they leave simply this idea that church discipline should be brought by the church against those who publish opinions or maintain practices that are contrary to the light of nature or to the known principles of Christianity. And they only have a couple of proof texts that deal with church discipline, the one in Titus about rebuking the heretic, and after the second warning, then you are to shun him, and so on. And then another big change that Bahnsen completely ignores, he doesn't even seem to be aware of these. He doesn't even mention this change here of chapter 20. And he doesn't even mention this one either in Larger Catechism, question 109. What are the sins forbidden in the second commandment? One of the sins that was originally listed there was tolerating a false religion. That was deleted by the American Presbyterians in 1788. Of course, they would say we shouldn't tolerate a false religion in the church. We shouldn't tolerate a false religion in our families. So the heads of households and the elders of the church should not. But the civil magistrate is no longer held accountable to enforce the second commandment in society. I believe that these major changes that Bahnsen completely ignores, doesn't even seem to be aware of, are significant because even though the American Presbyterians did not explicitly revise chapter 19, paragraph 4 regarding the judicial laws, yet I believe that these changes provide an implicit revision of general equity in 1904 by implicitly removing first table duties from general equity. I've acknowledged that they did believe that first table duties were a part of general equity, but in the original confession, the original divines, 1646, did believe that. But the American revisers took that away so that first table duties of the civil magistrate are no longer part of the general equity of the Mosaic Law. And if you want to read more about this, I have 2 papers on my website that detail the American revisions to the Westminster Standards and that deal specifically with Bonson's argument about them and responding to them.